Have you ever felt your mind as a turbulent kingdom, besieged by the anxieties of the unknown? Kant suggests this chaos arises when we forget who is sovereign, our own rational will. Tonight, we will calmly explore how to establish peace in your inner kingdom. So settle in, and let us begin this quiet construction. But let us pause at the threshold of this investigation, for we must first understand the nature of the problem before we can discover its solution. What is this turbulence we experience? Why does anxiety manifest not as a single adversary we might face in battle, but as a multiplicity of concerns, each pulling us in different directions, each demanding our immediate attention? The answer, I propose, lies in understanding the fundamental structure, or rather, the lack of structure, that characterizes our existence as sensuous beings in a world of phenomena. Consider the state in which most of us find ourselves at day's end. Our minds are populated by 1,000 concerns. The conversation that did not go as planned, the task left incomplete, the uncertainty of tomorrow's challenges, the persistent worry about whether we have done enough, been enough, secured enough. These are not mere thoughts. They are inclinations, each exerting its own gravitational pull upon our attention. And here we encounter our first crucial distinction. These inclinations are not governed by any universal law that we ourselves have legislated. They arise from the empirical conditions of our existence, from the contingent circumstances of our particular lives, from the accidents of our individual sensibility. This is what I term the anarchy of inclination. It is an anarchy in the precise philosophical sense, a state without archa, without a governing principle, without a sovereign legislator who establishes order through universal law. Each desire, each fear, each anxiety presents itself as urgent, as demanding, as possessing its own authority. Yet none of these inclinations can claim legitimate sovereignty over our faculty of choice, for they are merely particular, merely contingent, merely empirical. They belong to the realm of phenomena, the world as it appears to us through the lens of our sensibility, but they cannot, by their very nature, provide the universal and necessary principles by which a rational being ought to govern itself. Let us examine this condition more carefully, for understanding is the first step toward its remedy. Imagine, if you will, that you are standing in a great plaza, and from every direction, voices call out to you. One voice promises comfort if you will only rest. Another insists you must prepare for difficulties ahead. A third warns of dangers you have not yet considered. A fourth reminds you of pleasures you have not yet experienced. Each voice is persuasive in its own way. Each seems to present a legitimate claim upon your attention. Yet if you attempt to answer all these voices simultaneously, you will find yourself pulled in every direction at once, achieving nothing but exhaustion and confusion. This is the phenomenal condition of the human being who has not yet awakened to the dignity of reason. We are, by our nature as embodied beings, subject to inclinations. This is not a moral failing. It is simply a fact of our existence as creatures who possess sensibility, who experience pleasure and pain, who are affected by the empirical world around us. The inclinations themselves are morally neutral. They are neither good nor evil. They simply are, in the way that gravity simply is, exerting their force upon us whether we acknowledge them or not. But what condition is necessary for these inclinations to govern us so completely? The answer is our own passivity, our failure to recognize that we possess a faculty that stands above and beyond the realm of empirical inclination, the faculty of pure, practical reason. When we are governed by inclination alone, we are not truly acting. We are being acted upon. We are in a state of heteronomy, where the law that determines our choices comes from outside ourselves, from the contingent circumstances of our sensuous nature, rather than from the autonomous legislation of reason. Consider the nature of anxiety itself through this lens. Anxiety is not a simple fear of a determinate object. When we fear a lion, we know what we fear. and can take rational measures to avoid or confront the danger. But anxiety is diffuse, without clear object, precisely because it arises from the multitude of competing inclinations that have no governing principle to order them. We are anxious about everything and nothing, worried about possibilities that may never materialize, concerned about outcomes over which we may have no control. This anxiety is the symptom of a mind that has not yet recognized its own capacity for self-legislation. Think of reason as an architect who does not create the material, but designs the structure by which the material can become a building. Our inclinations are like stones scattered across a field, each possessing weight and substance, each real in its own right, but together forming no coherent structure. The architect does not deny the reality of the stones. Rather, the architect understands that these materials require a plan, a design, a principle of organization that comes not from the stones themselves, but from the rational faculty that can envision their proper arrangement. Now we must make a crucial distinction, one that will illuminate our entire investigation. There is a difference between acting in accordance with inclination and acting according to principle. When we act merely from inclination, even if the action happens to accord with duty, the action possesses no moral worth, for we are simply following the strongest impulse of the moment. We are like a stone rolling downhill, following the path of least resistance, determined entirely by external forces rather than by our own rational autonomy. But what does it mean to act according to principle? It means to act from a maxim, a subjective rule of action, that we ourselves can will to be a universal law. It means to step back from the immediate press of inclination and ask, what rule am I following here? Could this rule serve as a law for all rational beings? This capacity for self-examination, for stepping outside the stream of phenomenal causality and evaluating our own maxims, is what distinguishes us as rational beings from mere animals who follow instinct. Let me illustrate this with a simple example. Suppose you are exhausted at day's end, and you feel a strong inclination to neglect a promise you have made. The inclination is understandable. You are tired, the task is difficult, and immediate rest would bring immediate relief. If you act from this inclination alone, you are treating yourself as a mere phenomenon, a being entirely determined by the causal laws of sensibility. But if you pause and ask yourself, what maxim would I be following if I broke my promise? You activate your capacity for practical reason. The maxim might be, when keeping a promise becomes inconvenient, I will break it to serve my immediate comfort. Or could you will this as a universal law? Could you will that all rational beings, in similar circumstances, should break their promises whenever convenience dictates? The answer, clearly, is no. For if everyone followed such a maxim, the very institution of promising would collapse. Promises would mean nothing, and you would undermine the very purpose you sought to achieve through promising in the first place. This is not merely a practical observation about social consequences. It is a logical contradiction that reveals itself when we attempt to universalize the maxim. And in recognizing this contradiction, we discover that our reason itself legislates against the inclination. The authority here comes not from external reward or punishment, not from social approval or divine command, but from the internal structure of rationality itself. Having established this point, we can now deduce the following necessary consequence. Anxiety, in its deepest form, arises when we sense this contradiction within ourselves. We are beings who possess both sensibility and reason, both phenomenal and noumenal dimensions. When we live entirely according to inclination, treating ourselves as mere phenomena subject to the causal laws of sensibility, we experience a profound unease, for we sense, however dimly, that we are betraying our own rational nature. We are not living as the beings we truly are. This is why anxiety often intensifies precisely when we have secured the objects of our inclinations. The person who has achieved wealth may become more anxious about losing it. The person who has gained recognition may worry more about maintaining it. The satisfaction of one desire merely creates space for another to emerge in an endless succession that can never bring lasting peace. Why? Because we are seeking from the phenomenal world what only the noumenal dimension of our existence can provide. The sense of being governed by laws we ourselves have established, of being truly autonomous, and therefore truly free. Let us deepen our investigation by examining the temporal structure of anxiety. Notice that anxiety is always directed toward the future, toward possibilities, contingencies, outcomes that have not yet occurred. We are anxious about what might happen, what could go wrong, what we might fail to achieve. But this future orientation reveals something crucial about the nature of inclination itself. Inclinations are always particular and situated in time. I desire rest now. I fear failure tomorrow. I hope for success next week. Each inclination is bound to a specific moment, or anticipated moment, pulling me toward or away from particular future states. But because these inclinations are merely empirical, arising from the contingent conditions of my sensibility, they provide no stable ground for my existence. The future they project is always uncertain, always subject to forces beyond my control, always vulnerable to disappointment or unexpected change. This is the temporal anarchy that compounds the anarchy of competing inclinations. Not only am I pulled in multiple directions by different desires and fears, but each of these pulls is directed toward a future that I cannot fully control or predict. The result is a double anxiety: the anxiety of not knowing which inclination to follow, and the anxiety of not knowing whether following any particular inclination will actually lead to the satisfaction I anticipate. But what if there were a law that stood outside this temporal flux? What if there were a principle that remained valid regardless of changing circumstances, regardless of whether our particular inclinations are satisfied or frustrated? This is precisely what the moral law, as legislated by pure practical reason, provides. It is not conditional upon outcomes. It does not depend on whether following it brings us pleasure or pain. It simply is, as necessarily and universally as the principles of logic themselves. Consider how differently we relate to such a principle. When I act from duty, when I follow a maxim that I can will as a universal law, I am no longer at the mercy of contingent outcomes. Whether my action succeeds or fails in the empirical world, whether it brings me pleasure or pain, whether others approve or disapprove, I can know with certainty that I have acted as a rational being ought to act. This knowledge provides a foundation that no shifting circumstance can undermine. Let me be clear about what I am not saying. I am not suggesting that we can or should eliminate our inclinations, or that we can live as pure intellects without bodies, without sensibility, without the empirical dimension of our existence. This would be both impossible and undesirable. We are embodied rational beings, and our inclinations are a necessary part of our constitution. The task is not to deny our phenomenal nature, but to properly order it, to establish reason as the sovereign legislator, while acknowledging that inclinations provide the material with which reason must work. Think of a garden. The gardener does not wage war against the natural growth of plants. Rather, the gardener establishes a plan, a design, a principle of organization that allows each plant to flourish in its proper place. Some plants require more sun, others prefer shade. Some need frequent watering, others thrive in drier soil. The wise gardener understands these particular needs and accommodates them within the overall design. But it is the design itself, the rational plan, that transforms a field of competing vegetation into a harmonious garden. So too with our inner life. Reason does not seek to eliminate inclination, but to order it according to universal principles. The inclination toward rest is not evil. It becomes problematic only when it overrides our duties, when we allow it to determine our choices without submitting it to rational examination. The desire for security is not wrong. It becomes anxiety-producing only when we forget that no amount of external security can substitute for the internal peace that comes from living according to self-legislated law. Now we arrive at a subtle but crucial point. The anarchy of inclination is not merely a theoretical problem to be understood. It is an existential condition to be overcome through the active exercise of practical reason. Understanding alone is not sufficient. We must cultivate the capacity to govern ourselves according to rational principles, and this cultivation requires practice, attention, and what Kant calls the development of a good will. What is a good will? It is not a will that accidentally produces good outcomes, or a will that follows inclination when inclination happens to align with duty. A good will is one that acts from duty itself, that makes the moral law its supreme determining ground, regardless of what inclinations might be pulling in other directions. And here we encounter the remarkable proposition that a good will is the only thing that can be considered good without qualification. Why without qualification? Because all other goods, intelligence, courage, wealth, health, even happiness itself, can be used for evil purposes if they are not guided by a good will. A clever person without moral principle may be more dangerous than a foolish one. Courage in the service of wickedness is not admirable. Wealth can corrupt as easily as it can benefit. Even the pursuit of happiness, when made the supreme principle of action, can lead to moral disaster, for it provides no universal standard by which to judge between competing claims. But a good will, a will that consistently acts from duty, that makes the moral law its supreme determining ground, this remains good regardless of what it accomplishes in the empirical world. Even if circumstances prevent such a will from achieving its intended effects, even if every action undertaken from duty somehow fails to produce the desired outcome, the good will itself retains its full moral worth, shining like a jewel in its own right, valuable not for what it produces, but for what it is. This brings us to a profound insight about the nature of anxiety and its remedy. When we make outcomes the measure of our worth, when we judge ourselves by whether we have achieved success, gained approval, secured comfort, we place ourselves at the mercy of forces beyond our control. We become anxious because we cannot guarantee these outcomes. We cannot control all the variables that determine whether our actions will succeed in the empirical world. But when we make the good will itself the measure, when we judge ourselves by whether we have acted from duty, whether we have treated ourselves and others as ends in themselves rather than mere means, whether we have lived according to maxims we can will as universal laws, then we possess something that cannot be taken from us. We possess a ground of worth that does not depend on contingent circumstances, that remains stable regardless of external changes, that provides genuine and lasting peace. Let us pause here and reflect on what we have discovered. The anarchy of inclination, this state of being pulled in multiple directions by competing desires and fears, this anxiety about uncertain futures and uncontrollable outcomes, arises from treating ourselves as mere phenomena, as beings entirely determined by the causal laws of sensibility. We have forgotten, or perhaps never fully recognized, that we possess a faculty of pure practical reason that can legislate universal laws and thereby establish order in our inner kingdom. But understanding this is only the beginning. We have identified the problem and glimpsed the shape of its solution, but we have not yet examined how reason actually performs this legislative function. We have not yet explored the specific principles by which a rational being can govern itself, nor have we considered how to construct what Kant beautifully terms a kingdom of ends, a systematic union of rational beings under common laws, beginning with the government of our own inner life. The night is still young, and our investigation has just begun. We have established the foundation, clarified the terms of our inquiry, and set the stage for the constructive work ahead. In the phenomenal realm, anxiety and chaos may seem to reign, but beyond this realm of appearances lies our noumenal nature, our capacity for rational autonomy, our power to be legislators for ourselves. As you rest here in the quiet darkness, feeling perhaps the familiar pull of various inclinations and concerns, know that you possess within yourself the capacity to establish order. The sovereignty you seek is not something you must win from external forces. It is something you must claim by recognizing your own rational nature. The peace you desire is not the peace of having no inclinations, but the peace of having established reason as the supreme determining ground of your will. This is not a peace that comes all at once, nor is it a state we achieve once and maintain effortlessly thereafter. It is a condition we must actively cultivate through the patient exercise of practical reason, through the consistent examination of our maxims, through the habitual practice of treating ourselves and others with the dignity appropriate to rational beings. It is, in short, the work of a lifetime, but it is work that begins here, now, in this moment of quiet reflection. Let your breathing slow and deepen as we pause in our investigation. Feel the weight of your body against the surface that supports you. Notice how the room around you has grown quieter, how the urgencies of the day have begun to recede. This physical settling mirrors the work we are undertaking philosophically. The gradual establishment of order, the patient construction of a framework within which even our restless inclinations can find their proper place. In the architecture of reason we are beginning to build, there is room for rest, room for concern, room for hope and fear. But each element is situated within a structure governed by universal law, rather than scattered in anarchic confusion. The task is not to suppress or deny any part of our nature, but to understand how each part relates to the whole, how each inclination can serve, rather than undermine, our rational autonomy. And as we prepare to continue our investigation into how this legislative function actually works, into the specific principles by which reason establishes its sovereignty, remember this: the very fact that you can understand these distinctions, that you can reflect upon your own maxims and evaluate them against universal standards, proves that you possess the capacity we are discussing. You are not merely a phenomenon to be acted upon by external forces. You are a rational being with the power of self-legislation. And in recognizing this power, you have already taken the first step toward establishing peace in your inner kingdom. The stone we have just placed serves as the foundation for a more elaborate structure. Having understood the chaos that arises when inclination rules without principle, we must now investigate the positive power by which order is established, the legislative function of pure, practical reason itself. This is not merely a theoretical exercise. It is the construction of a framework by which you can, even now as you rest, begin to envision the architecture of a well-governed inner life. When we speak of reason as legislative, we employ more than mere metaphor. Just as a civil legislator establishes laws for a commonwealth, so too does practical reason establish laws for the governance of the will. But there is a crucial difference that illuminates everything that follows. While civil laws are imposed from without, moral laws are legislated from within. We are both the legislators and the subjects of moral law, both sovereigns and citizens of our own inner kingdom. This is the paradox and the glory of rational autonomy. Let us begin by examining what it means for a law to be truly universal. A universal law is one that holds necessarily and without exception for all rational beings as such. It does not depend on particular circumstances, individual preferences, or contingent goals. When I say that 2 + 2 = 4, I state a universal truth that remains valid regardless of whether anyone desires it to be so, regardless of cultural differences, regardless of temporal location. The necessity here is absolute. But can there be such laws for action, for the choices we make in governing our lives? Can there be practical principles that possess the same universality and necessity as mathematical truths? This is the question that occupied me throughout my critical investigations, and the answer I discovered is both surprising and profoundly liberating. Yes, there can be, but only if we identify the formal structure that makes such laws possible. Consider what happens when you act from a maxim, a subjective principle of action. Suppose your maxim is, "I will keep my promises because keeping promises helps me maintain good relationships." This maxim has a certain prudential wisdom, but notice its structure. It makes promise-keeping conditional upon a particular goal, namely, maintaining relationships. It is what I call a hypothetical imperative. It commands, if you want to maintain good relationships, then keep your promises. Now, hypothetical imperatives are perfectly valid and useful in their proper place. They tell us what means to employ if we have certain ends, but they cannot serve as the foundation for moral law, because they depend on whether we happen to have the ends in question. If you do not care about maintaining relationships, the imperative loses its force. It provides no universal ground for action because it is conditional, contingent, dependent on subjective goals that may vary from person to person. What we seek, then, is a categorical imperative, a command that holds unconditionally, regardless of our particular inclinations or goals. But how can such an imperative be possible? What could command us absolutely, not as means to some further end, but as an end in itself? The answer emerges when we consider the formal structure of law itself. A law, properly speaking, must be universal in form. It cannot contain references to particular individuals, particular circumstances, or particular times, for then it would not be a law, but merely an arbitrary rule. When we ask whether a maxim can serve as a universal law, we are asking whether we can consistently will that everyone in similar circumstances should act according to this maxim. And here we discover the supreme principle of morality, what I call the categorical imperative. Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Let us examine how this principle actually functions, for in understanding its operation, we discover the mechanism by which reason legislates order in our inner kingdom. Take the maxim we considered earlier. When keeping a promise becomes inconvenient, I will break it to serve my immediate comfort. Can this maxim be universalized? Can we will it as a law for all rational beings? When we attempt to universalize this maxim, we encounter a contradiction. If everyone broke promises when they became inconvenient, the institution of promising itself would collapse. No one would trust promises, and therefore the very purpose for which we make promises, to establish reliable commitments that bind us to future action, would be undermined. We cannot consistently will both that promises should exist as meaningful commitments and that they should be broken whenever they become inconvenient. The maxim contains an internal contradiction when universalized. But notice what has happened here. We have not appealed to consequences, to utility, to divine command, or to social convention. We have simply examined the logical structure of the maxim itself and discovered that it cannot be consistently universalized. The authority that prohibits acting on this maxim comes from reason itself, from the very structure of rational consistency. This is why moral obligation possesses absolute necessity. It is grounded in the logic of practical reason, which is the same for all rational beings. Now, you might ask, why should I care about logical consistency? Why should the fact that a maxim cannot be universalized provide any motivation for me to act differently? This is a profound question, and it takes us to the heart of what it means to be a rational being. The answer is that you cannot coherently reject the authority of logical consistency without simultaneously rejecting your own rational nature. To say, I am a rational being, but I do not care whether my principles are logically consistent, is to assert a contradiction. For rationality just is the capacity to recognize and submit to the demands of logical consistency. When you recognize that a maxim cannot be universalized, and yet you continue to act on it, you are in effect denying your own rational nature. You are treating yourself as a mere phenomenon, a being determined entirely by inclination, rather than as the noumenal being you truly are, a being capable of self-legislation according to universal law. And this self-denial, I propose, is the deepest source of the anxiety we examined in our first investigation. It is the unease of existing in contradiction with oneself. Let me illustrate this with another example, one that touches more directly on the quiet concerns that may occupy your mind as you rest here in the darkness. Suppose you find yourself troubled by feelings of inadequacy, worried that you have not accomplished enough, not become enough, not secured enough recognition or achievement. These feelings are inclinations. They arise from your empirical nature, from your existence as a being situated in a social world with all its demands and expectations. Now, you might adopt the maxim, I will judge my worth by my accomplishments and by the recognition I receive from others. This is a very common maxim in our competitive world, so common that it seems almost natural. But let us examine it through the lens of the categorical imperative. Can this maxim be universalized? If we will that all rational beings should judge their worth by their accomplishments and recognition, we create a system in which human dignity becomes conditional, contingent, subject to arbitrary standards that may vary wildly between different times and cultures. We would be treating rational beings, including ourselves, as having value only insofar as they produce certain outcomes or receive certain forms of approval. But can we consistently will this as a universal law? The answer reveals itself when we consider what grounds the very capacity for accomplishment and recognition in the first place. These things are possible only because we are rational beings with inherent dignity, beings capable of setting ends and pursuing them, beings who can recognize and respond to reasons. The accomplishments and recognition are effects that presuppose the inherent worth of the rational being as their cause. To make worth conditional upon these effects is to reverse the true order of things, to make the foundation dependent upon what it itself grounds. Here we encounter the second formulation of the categorical imperative, which reveals more explicitly what was implicit in the first. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. Rational nature, the capacity for self-legislation according to universal law, possesses absolute worth, what I call dignity, precisely because it is the source of all other values. It is that which can set ends, can recognize worth, can legislate laws. To treat it as a mere means, as having value only conditionally, is to commit a fundamental error in practical reasoning. When you judge your worth by accomplishments or recognition, you are treating your rational nature as a mere means to these external ends. You are forgetting that it is your rational nature itself, your capacity to understand, to judge, to choose according to principle, that makes any accomplishment possible and any recognition meaningful. And in this forgetting, you place yourself at the mercy of contingent outcomes, generating precisely the anxiety we seek to overcome. But what condition is necessary to remember your inherent dignity? It requires what I call respect for the moral law, not in the sense of fearful obedience to an external authority, but in the sense of recognition that the law is your own legislation, the expression of your deepest nature as a rational being. When you act from duty, when you follow a maxim you can will as universal law, you are not submitting to alien constraint. You are expressing your own autonomy, your own freedom, your own legislative authority. This is a subtle but transformative insight. The moral law, far from being a restriction on freedom, is the very condition of true freedom. When you act from mere inclination, you are determined by causes outside your rational control, by the contingent circumstances of your sensibility, by the arbitrary play of pleasure and pain, by the external pressures of your environment. You are in this state heteronymous, governed by foreign law. But when you act from duty, from respect for a law you yourself have legislated through the exercise of pure practical reason. You are autonomous, self-governing, truly free. Imagine reason, then, not as a harsh judge imposing arbitrary restrictions, but as a wise counselor who reminds you of your own dignity and power. When inclination urges you to treat yourself or others as mere means, when anxiety tempts you to seek your worth in contingent outcomes, reason gently but firmly recalls you to the truth. You are a legislator, not merely a subject. You possess dignity, not merely conditional worth. You are an end in yourself, not merely a means to other ends. This legislative function of reason operates through what I call the autonomy of the will. A will is autonomous when it gives law to itself, when it determines itself according to principles it recognizes as universally valid, rather than being determined by external causes. And here we arrive at a remarkable conclusion. Autonomy is not merely compatible with law, it is the very ground of moral law. Only a will that legislates for itself can be bound by genuine moral obligation, for only such a will can recognize the authority of universal law as its own authority. Consider how this transforms our understanding of duty. Duty is not an external imposition that conflicts with freedom. It is the self-imposition of law by a rational will that recognizes its own legislative authority. When you feel the pull of duty, what you feel is your own rational nature asserting its supremacy over the anarchy of inclination. And when you act from duty, you are most fully yourself, most fully expressing your nature as a rational being, most fully exercising your freedom. Let us deepen this point by examining the relationship between freedom and necessity. In the phenomenal world, the world of appearances governed by causal laws, everything is determined. Each event is the necessary effect of prior causes, extending back in an unbroken chain. Your inclinations, your desires, your fears, all arise according to the laws of psychological causality, determined by factors you did not choose and cannot fully control. But you are not merely a phenomenon. You possess, in addition to your empirical character as a being in the world of appearances, an intelligible character as a rational being capable of acting according to self-legislated law. And in this intelligible character lies your freedom. Not the freedom to act without any law, which would be mere arbitrary chance, but the freedom to act according to laws you yourself establish through the exercise of pure practical reason. This freedom is perfectly compatible with necessity, indeed requires necessity, but it is the necessity of rational law rather than empirical causality. When you act from duty, you act necessarily, not because you are forced by external causes, but because you recognize the internal necessity of the moral law as legislated by your own reason. You freely bind yourself to what reason commands, and in this self-binding lies your autonomy. Think of it this way. A stone falls to the ground because it must, determined entirely by the law of gravity and its initial conditions. It has no choice, no freedom, no autonomy. But when you keep a promise because you have willed promise-keeping as a universal law, you act necessarily. The law commands without exception, and yet you act freely, for the law is your own legislation. This is the synthesis of freedom and necessity that characterizes rational autonomy, and it is this synthesis that provides the foundation for a well-ordered inner life. Now we can begin to see how reason actually establishes peace in the kingdom of the mind. When inclinations conflict, when anxiety arises from the press of competing demands, reason does not resolve the conflict by privileging one inclination over another, for that would merely substitute one form of heteronomy for another. Rather, reason steps back from all particular inclinations and asks, what principle can govern here? What maxim can I adopt that I could will as a universal law? In asking this question, you shift from being a mere subject of empirical causality to being a legislator of universal law. You claim your sovereignty. And in claiming this sovereignty, you discover that many of the conflicts that seemed intractable suddenly dissolve. The anxiety about whether you have accomplished enough loses its grip when you remember that your worth is not conditional upon accomplishment. The fear of others' disapproval fades when you recognize that your dignity does not depend on their recognition. The pull of conflicting desires becomes manageable when you understand that none of them can claim legitimate authority over a will that governs itself according to rational principle. This is not to say that the inclinations disappear or that acting from duty becomes easy. Our empirical nature remains, with all its desires and aversions, all its pleasures and pains. But these inclinations now take their proper place as material to be governed rather than as sovereign powers that determine our choices. They provide the circumstances within which we act, the conditions we must take into account, but they no longer dictate the principles by which we act. Let me offer a practical example of how this legislative function operates in daily life. Suppose you face a decision about whether to tell a difficult truth to someone you care about. Your inclinations pull in different directions. The desire to avoid conflict, the fear of hurting someone's feelings, perhaps even a certain pleasure in avoiding an uncomfortable conversation. These are all understandable empirical motivations. But when you examine the matter through the lens of practical reason, you ask, what maxim would I be following if I concealed this truth? Perhaps, I will conceal truths when revealing them would create discomfort. Can you will this as a universal law? If everyone concealed uncomfortable truths, communication itself would be undermined. We would treat each other not as rational beings capable of handling truth and making informed decisions, but as mere objects to be managed for our own emotional convenience. We would be using others as means to our comfort rather than respecting them as ends in themselves. Recognizing this, duty becomes clear. Respect for rational nature demands that we treat others as capable of receiving and responding to truth, even when truth is difficult. This does not mean we must be cruel or tactless. Practical wisdom, what the ancients called phronesis, governs the manner and timing of communication. But the principle is established. We owe others the respect of honesty, for anything less treats them as less than the rational beings they are. Notice what has happened in this examination. The anxieties about conflict and discomfort have not disappeared, but they have been contextualized within a framework of principle. You still feel the inclinations, but you are no longer governed by them. You have exercised your legislative authority, determined what duty requires, and in doing so have established order in what might otherwise have been a chaotic internal struggle. This is the ongoing work of practical reason, not a single dramatic act of will that settles everything once and for all, but a patient, consistent practice of examining maxims, testing them against the standard of universalizability, and choosing to act from duty even when inclination pulls in another direction. It is, in the truest sense, the cultivation of character, the development of what I call a good will. And as you rest here in the quiet darkness, feeling perhaps the day's tensions beginning to release, you can understand that this cultivation is not separate from the peace you seek. The peace of a well-governed inner life is not the peace of having no conflicts or challenges. It is the peace of having established reason as the supreme determining ground of your will. It is the peace of knowing that, whatever empirical circumstances you face, whatever inclinations arise, you possess within yourself the legislative authority to determine how you will respond. This peace deepens as you practice the exercise of practical reason. Initially, it may require conscious effort to examine your maxims, to test them against the standard of universalizability, to recognize and resist the subtle ways inclination disguises itself as duty. But gradually, through consistent practice, acting from duty becomes more natural, not because reason becomes any less demanding, but because you become more practiced in its exercise. You develop what Kant calls moral character, a settled disposition to make the moral law your supreme determining ground. Think of learning any complex skill. playing an instrument, mastering a craft, developing athletic ability. At first, every movement requires conscious attention. Every decision must be deliberately made. But with practice, the skills become integrated. The movements flow naturally. The decisions resolve themselves with increasing ease. So too with moral character. The more consistently you exercise your legislative authority, the more naturally reason assumes its proper role as sovereign of your inner kingdom. But we must be careful here to distinguish between two very different things: the development of moral character and the development of mere habit. Habit is mechanical, operating according to the laws of psychological causality without the involvement of rational principle. You can develop the habit of telling the truth simply because lying has brought bad consequences in the past, or the habit of keeping promises simply because you were trained to do so as a child. But these habits, even when they produce actions that conform to duty, possess no moral worth, for they do not arise from respect for law as legislated by reason itself. True moral character involves the consistent exercise of practical reason in evaluating maxims and choosing to act from duty. It means that even when a habitual pattern might produce the right action, you still examine the principle underlying your choice, still ensure that you are acting from duty rather than merely in conformity with duty. This ongoing examination is what keeps the legislative function of reason active and prevents morality from collapsing into mere social conditioning. And here, we encounter a beautiful paradox. The more you exercise your rational autonomy, the more you discover that genuine freedom is not arbitrary license, but self-legislation according to universal law. The person who acts from mere inclination, following whatever desire is strongest in the moment, appears to be free, but is actually bound by psychological causes beyond their control. The person who acts from duty, binding themselves to universal law, appears to be constrained but is actually exercising the only genuine freedom, the autonomy of a will that gives law to itself. As the quiet of the evening deepens around you, as your breathing slows and your body settles into rest, you can begin to feel this truth in your very being. The day's anxieties arose from treating yourself as a mere phenomenon, subject to the contingent causality of empirical circumstances. But you are more than a phenomenon. You are a rational being with legislative authority, and no empirical circumstance can remove this dignity from you unless you yourself renounce it by refusing to exercise your rational autonomy. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, its own conflicts of inclination, its own opportunities to exercise your legislative authority. But having understood the principle by which reason orders the inner kingdom, you can face these challenges with a peace that does not depend on circumstances. You possess within yourself the capacity to determine how you will respond, what maxims you will follow, what principles you will make the determining ground of your will. This is not a peace that makes you passive or indifferent to the world. On the contrary, it is the peace that makes genuine action possible, action that expresses your rational nature rather than merely reactions determined by external causes. It is the peace of knowing that, whatever happens, you can govern yourself according to universal law, maintaining your dignity and autonomy regardless of empirical outcomes. Let this understanding settle into your mind as your body settles into deeper rest. The legislative function of reason is not something foreign or difficult to access. It is your own deepest nature, the faculty that distinguishes you as a rational being, the source of your inherent dignity and worth. In exercising this faculty, you do not become someone different. You become most fully yourself. The foundation has been laid carefully, stone upon stone. We have understood the anarchy that reigns when inclination governs unchecked, and we have discovered how reason exercises its legislative authority to establish universal law. But understanding the principle is not yet the same as envisioning its fulfillment. We have mapped the territory, but we have not yet walked through it, not yet inhabited it. Now we must undertake the most beautiful and most practical part of our investigation, the construction of what I call a kingdom of ends, a systematic union of rational beings under common laws, beginning with the governance of one's own inner life and extending outward to embrace all rational beings. What, precisely, is a kingdom of ends? It is not a place or a state that exists merely in imagination, though it begins there as a vision that guides our choices. Rather, it is a systematic organization of rational beings who treat themselves and each other as ends in themselves, whose actions are governed by universal laws they recognize as their own legislation. It is the highest good toward which practical reason directs us, the goal that emerges naturally when we understand and consistently exercise our rational autonomy. Let us begin by recognizing that we do not exist in isolation. You are surrounded by other rational beings, other minds capable of understanding, choosing, and legislating according to universal law. Each of these beings possesses the same dignity that you possess, the same inherent worth that cannot be made conditional upon accomplishment or recognition. And when you recognize this truth, not merely as an abstract principle but with full acknowledgement of what it means, you discover that your own legislation creates obligations toward these other rational beings. Here we must pause and distinguish between two very different ways of relating to others. The first is what I call treating them as means. When you use another person merely as a means, you treat their rational nature as subordinate to your own purposes. You ask, what can this person do for me? How can I manipulate their choices to serve my ends? You may care about them in a way, but ultimately you value them only insofar as they serve your purposes. When they cease to be useful, you discard them or relegate them to lesser concern. This is not always immoral. We all, in a certain sense, use others as means. The shopkeeper helps us acquire what we need, the teacher conveys knowledge, the artist provides beauty. These transactions are not inherently wrong, but they become problematic. Indeed, become what I term the deepest violation of morality, when they are pursued without respect for the rational nature of the other person. The shopkeeper may be treated as a mere instrument for acquiring goods, or they may be treated as a rational being capable of understanding, making choices, maintaining dignity. What is the difference? It lies in the presence or absence of what I call respect. When you treat another person as a mere means, you relate to their body and their capacities, but you deny their rational nature. You do not inform them fully of what you intend. Do not give them genuine choice about whether to participate. Do not acknowledge their perspective as having any weight in your deliberation. You operate, in effect, as if they were objects rather than subjects, things rather than persons. But when you treat another person as an end in themselves, you acknowledge their rational nature and its dignity. You recognize that they, like you, are capable of understanding, choosing, and legislating according to universal law. You provide them with information rather than manipulating them through deceit. You offer them genuine options rather than coercing them into compliance. You listen to their perspective, their concerns, their values, and you take these seriously in your deliberations. You treat them, in short, as a rational being whose consent matters not because it serves your purposes, but because they are, in their very nature, a being capable of rational autonomy. Now imagine a society, or beginning with your own mind, a kingdom of your own faculties, where every rational being is treated as an end in themselves. What would such a kingdom look like? First, it would be characterized by what I call the universal dignity of all rational beings. No one would be valued more or less based on their abilities, their wealth, their social status, or their usefulness to others. The dignity would be equal and inalienable, grounded not in any contingent property, but in the very fact of being a rational being capable of self-legislation. Second, such a kingdom would be characterized by the prevalence of respect for the moral law. Each member would recognize that the supreme principle of morality is to act only according to maxims that one can will as universal laws, and each would exercise their rational autonomy to make this principle the determining ground of their choices. Not because they were forced to do so, not because they feared punishment or hoped for reward, but because they had come to understand that this principle expresses their own deepest nature and dignity. Third, such a kingdom would be characterized by a particular kind of freedom, not the arbitrary freedom to do whatever one pleases regardless of consequences or principle, but the freedom of rational autonomy, the freedom to give laws to oneself and to govern oneself accordingly. In this kingdom, freedom and law would not be in conflict. They would be understood as inseparable. To be free would mean to be self-governing according to universal principles, and to be governed by universal law would mean to be governed by one's own rational legislation. But here, we must make a crucial distinction, one that will illuminate everything that follows. The kingdom of ends, as I describe it, is not merely an ideal realm that exists only in imagination, detached from the real world in which we live. It is, rather, a reality that emerges in the measure that rational beings exercise their autonomy and recognize the dignity of themselves and others. It is both a vision that guides our actions and a reality that grows through the consistent practice of treating ourselves and others as ends in themselves. Consider your own inner kingdom first, the systematic organization of your own faculties under the governance of reason. In your mind, there are many competing powers: the desire for pleasure, the fear of pain, the concern for security, the longing for recognition, the impulse toward connection, the drive for achievement. These are not evil in themselves. They are the natural manifestations of your existence as an embodied being in a world of other beings. But they compete for dominance, each seeking to make itself the supreme determining ground of your will. Now imagine reason establishing a constitution for your inner kingdom, a system of laws by which these competing powers can coexist without descending into anarchy. Some desires may be legitimately satisfied when they align with duty. Others must be subordinated to principle. Some fears deserve attention and may guide wise caution. Others must be recognized as irrational anxieties to be overcome through rational reflection. The sovereignty is not given to any of these competing powers, but to reason itself, which legislates according to universal principles that respect the dignity of all the faculties involved. This is not a tyranny of reason over the body's desires. It is, rather, a constitutional framework in which each part is recognized as legitimate within its proper sphere. The desire for pleasure is not denied, but is given its place within a hierarchy ordered by principle. The body's need for rest and nourishment is not rejected, but is integrated into a life ordered according to duty. The inclinations are not eradicated, but are brought into harmony through the establishment of rational law as supreme. When you govern yourself in this way, when you consistently examine your maxims, test them against the principle of universalizability, and act from duty rather than mere inclination, you are constructing your own kingdom of ends at the most intimate level. You are establishing reason as the sovereign legislator, and you are recognizing yourself as both legislator and citizen, both the author of law and one who chooses to be bound by it. This self-governance is, paradoxically, the highest form of freedom. But your kingdom does not end at the boundaries of your own mind. You are one rational being among many, and just as you claim the right to self-governance according to rational principle, so too do all others possess this same right. This is where the kingdom of ends expands beyond the merely personal and becomes genuinely universal. What condition is necessary for genuine community among rational beings? It is the mutual recognition of dignity, the acknowledgement that each person is an end in themselves, not merely a means to the purposes of others. When this recognition is absent, what results is not community but exploitation, whether subtle or overt. Some people are treated as instruments for the benefit of others, some as objects to be managed, some as problems to be solved. But true community, the kingdom of ends in its full social dimension arises only when each member recognizes in the others the same rational dignity they claim for themselves. Consider how this transforms ordinary human relations. In a workplace governed by mere self-interest, the employer sees workers as units of production to be exploited for maximum profit, and the workers see the employer as a source of income to be extracted with minimum effort. There is no genuine relationship, no mutual recognition of dignity, only a mutual exploitation constrained by law and custom. But imagine instead a workplace where both employer and employees recognize each other as rational beings worthy of respect. The employer would not extract maximum labor for minimum wage. This would treat workers as mere things, as sources of profit, rather than as beings with their own projects and dignity. The employees would not shirk their responsibilities or steal from their employer. This would treat the employer as a thing to be used rather than a person to be respected. Instead, each would deal with the others honestly, seeking terms that both parties could will as universal laws, respecting the other's capacity for rational autonomy even while pursuing legitimate interests. The resulting relationship would not be one of perfect altruism or complete equality. Differences in power, knowledge, and circumstance are real and cannot be ignored, but it would be one characterized by a fundamental respect for the humanity of the other, a recognition that their consent matters not merely instrumentally, but intrinsically. Now expand this vision outward. Imagine a society where this principle governed all interactions, not merely between employer and employee, but between all persons in all circumstances. Imagine a world where each person asked before acting, "Can I will that all rational beings should act according to this maxim? If others acted as I propose to act, would I accept this as a universal law?" In such a world, there would be no deception, for deception treats others as incapable of understanding truth and making informed decisions. It denies them the dignity of rational beings. There would be no coercion, for coercion treats others as mere objects to be moved about according to one's will rather than as rational beings capable of autonomous choice. There would be no exploitation, for exploitation treats others as having value only insofar as they serve one's purposes, rather than as beings whose dignity is inalienable. Yet neither would such a world be one of passivity or indifference. People would still pursue their projects and goals, seek what they need and desire, engage in the normal business of life, but they would do so always with respect for the rational nature of others, always treating them as partners rather than as means, always open to dialogue and genuine consideration of the other's perspective. This is the kingdom of ends, not a fantasy, not an unrealizable utopia, but a vision that can be progressively actualized through the consistent choice of each individual to treat themselves and others as ends in themselves. It grows as we grow in our understanding of rational dignity and in our capacity to exercise our autonomy according to universal principle. Think of reason as an architect who does not create the materials but designs the structure by which the materials can become a harmonious whole. In your inner kingdom, reason designs the structure by which competing inclinations can be integrated into a unified personality ordered by principle. In the broader kingdom of ends, reason designs the structure by which different rational beings, pursuing different projects and possessing different perspectives, can coexist in mutual recognition of each other's dignity. But now, let us consider what makes this vision realizable, what practical steps can be taken to move from the vision toward its actualization. This is where the kingdom of ends ceases to be mere abstraction and becomes a guide for concrete action. The first and most fundamental step is the cultivation of what I call reverence for the moral law, what might also be termed respect for rational dignity, including one's own. This reverence is not fear, nor is it the obedience of a subject to an alien master. Rather, it is the recognition that in committing oneself to act according to universal principle, One is expressing one's deepest nature as a rational being and honoring the dignity of all beings who share this nature. This reverence begins with oneself. When you treat yourself as worthy of respect, when you refuse to degrade yourself by acting according to maxims you would not will as universal laws, when you maintain your dignity by making duty, rather than mere inclination, your guide, you are honoring yourself as a rational being. This is not pride or arrogance. It is the honest recognition of your own worth and capacity. And in honoring yourself in this way, you create the foundation for honoring others. For if you treat yourself as an end in yourself, recognizing your own dignity and governing yourself according to rational principle, you cannot consistently treat others as mere means. The maxim by which you govern yourself, that rational beings deserve respect, that dignity is inalienable, that we should act only according to principles we can will as universal, applies equally to all rational beings. To exempt others from this principle while insisting on it for yourself would be to fall into contradiction, to assert that your dignity matters while the dignity of others does not. Therefore, the development of self-respect and the development of respect for others are inseparable. They grow together, reinforcing each other. As you learn to govern yourself according to principle, you naturally begin to treat others with greater respect, recognizing in them the same rational capacity and dignity you are cultivating in yourself. Conversely, as you encounter the dignity of others and recognize their capacity for autonomous choice, you are reminded of the importance of governing your own life according to principle rather than mere inclination. This mutual development gives rise to what we might call the social dimension of the kingdom of ends. We are not isolated monads, each cultivating our own virtue in splendid isolation. We are interconnected beings whose actions affect each other, whose choices ripple outward to touch the lives of others. The kingdom of ends, therefore, is not something we construct individually, but something we construct together, each person contributing to the creation of a social order in which rational dignity is universally recognized and respected. But here we encounter a practical difficulty that must be acknowledged. We live not in a kingdom of ends, but in a world where violence, deception, and exploitation remain all too common. We encounter people who do not respect the dignity of others, who exploit and manipulate for their own benefit, who ignore the claims of rationality in pursuit of mere inclination. In such a world, can the vision of the kingdom of ends be anything more than a beautiful fantasy? The answer is yes, but only with an important qualification. The kingdom of ends cannot be fully realized in a world where not everyone respects the dignity of others and commits to acting according to universal principle. So long as some pursue their inclinations without regard to whether they can will their maxims as universal laws, so long as some treat others as mere means, the full actualization of the kingdom of ends remains incomplete. But this does not render the vision useless or illusory. First, it means that we can and must construct partial kingdoms of ends, relationships, institutions, and communities within the broader world where the principles of mutual respect and rational dignity are recognized and honored. In a family where parents treat children as beings worthy of respect rather than mere objects to be controlled, a kingdom of ends has been created. In a business where employees are treated as persons with dignity and not mere instruments of profit, a kingdom of ends has been established. In a friendship based on mutual recognition of worth rather than mere utility, a kingdom of ends exists. Second, it means that progress toward the fuller realization of the kingdom of ends is possible through the cumulative effect of individual choices. Each person who decides to treat themselves and others with respect, who governs their life according to universal principle rather than mere inclination, who refuses to exploit others and demands not to be exploited, contributes to the gradual transformation of the world toward greater recognition of rational dignity. It is not a guaranteed process, nor is it one that reaches perfect completion in history. But it is a real process, and each individual choice to act according to principle rather than mere inclination is a contribution to it. Third, it means that even in a world where the kingdom of ends is not fully realized, even when facing others who do not respect rational dignity, you can still govern yourself according to principle. Your dignity does not depend on others' recognition of it. Your autonomy does not require a perfect social order in which to be exercised. You can maintain your integrity, can act according to maxims you will as universal laws, can treat others as ends in themselves, regardless of whether they reciprocate. This is where the peace we seek is grounded, not in external circumstances that may be beyond your control, but in your own capacity to govern yourself according to rational principle. Imagine, then, that as you rest here in the quiet darkness, you are not merely an isolated individual, but a participant in a larger community of rational beings. Some of these beings you interact with directly: your family, friends, colleagues, acquaintances. Others you encounter only indirectly, through the effects of your choices rippling outward into the world. Still others you may never meet, yet your commitment to universal principle connects you to them as fellow members of the kingdom of ends. In every interaction, you have the opportunity to contribute to the actualization of this kingdom. When you treat someone with honesty rather than deception, you honor their rational nature. When you give them genuine choice rather than coercing them, you respect their autonomy. When you listen to their perspective and take it seriously, you acknowledge their dignity. When you keep your commitments and expect the same of others, you strengthen the bonds of mutual trust that make genuine community possible. But more fundamentally, the kingdom of ends is actualized through the internal governance of one's own will. Each time you examine a maxim and recognize that you cannot will it as a universal law, each time you choose to act from duty despite the pull of inclination, each time you treat yourself as an end in yourself rather than merely as an instrument for the satisfaction of desires, you are building the kingdom of ends within yourself. And as more individuals do this, as more people choose to govern themselves according to rational principle, the kingdom of ends gradually extends outward, transforming not just individual lives, but the fabric of society itself. This is why the cultivation of moral character, the development of a settled disposition to make the moral law one's supreme determining ground, is not a purely private matter with merely personal significance. It is, in fact, a profoundly political matter, in the deepest sense of that term. To commit oneself to acting according to universal principle is to commit oneself to contributing to the creation of a just social order, one based on mutual respect for rational dignity, rather than on domination and manipulation. The peace that comes from such commitment is not the peace of having solved all problems or achieved all goals. It is the peace of knowing that, whatever circumstances you face, you can maintain your integrity, can govern yourself according to principle, can treat yourself and others with the dignity appropriate to rational beings. It is the peace of participating, however modestly, in the progressive actualization of the kingdom of ends. It is the peace of knowing that your choices matter, that they contribute to a world that honors the dignity of all rational beings. And as your body becomes heavier with rest, as the concerns of the day fade into the background, you can sense the presence of this larger kingdom in which you participate. You are not isolated in your struggles and achievements. You are part of a community of rational beings, past and present, all working toward the recognition and realization of universal human dignity. Your commitment to principle contributes to this larger work. Your respect for yourself and others extends far beyond the immediate circumstances of your life. This is the vision that emerges when we truly understand what it means to be a rational being, to possess inherent dignity, to participate in a kingdom where reason legislates universal law, and all members recognize each other's worth. It is a vision that inspires not despair at the imperfections of the actual world, but rather a patient determination to contribute to its gradual transformation. It is a vision that provides the foundation for the final peace we will explore, The peace of a sovereign will at rest in the knowledge of its own autonomy and the worth of its choices. We have traveled far in our philosophical journey through the night. We have descended into the depths of the anarchy that reigns when inclination governs without principle. We have ascended to understand how reason legislates universal law, establishing order through the categorical imperative. We have surveyed the landscape of the kingdom of ends, that vision of a community of rational beings united in mutual recognition of each other's dignity. Now, we arrive at the final destination of our investigation, the culmination toward which all previous steps have been moving, the serenity of the sovereign will, resting in the knowledge of its own autonomy and the worth of its choices. What is this serenity? It is not the peace of mere tranquility, the blankness of a mind that has ceased to think or feel. It is not the satisfaction of appetites gratified or anxieties escaped. It is, rather, the deep calm that comes when the inner kingdom has been rightly ordered, when reason has established its sovereignty and all the competing powers within have accepted their proper place within its constitution. It is the peace of a will that has recognized its own autonomy and chosen to exercise it consistently, responsibly, magnificently. Let us approach this final understanding by returning to the question with which we began. What is anxiety? We identified it as the condition of a mind pulled in multiple directions, lacking a governing principle, vulnerable to forces beyond its control. But now we can understand it more deeply. Anxiety arises not merely from the presence of competing inclinations, but from the fundamental experience of estrangement from one's own rational nature. It is the unease of a being that possesses the capacity for autonomous self-governance, yet lives as though this capacity did not exist, allowing itself to be determined by external circumstances and empirical causality. But what happens when you fully acknowledge and consistently exercise your rational autonomy? What occurs in the architecture of your inner life when reason has definitively established its sovereignty? The anxiety does not disappear immediately or all at once, for you remain an embodied being in a world of contingency, and the empirical conditions that give rise to concern will continue to exist. But the character of these concerns changes fundamentally. They are no longer the anxieties of heteronomy, the panic of a being without governance. They are instead the deliberate concerns of an autonomous will, chosen and managed according to rational principle. Consider the distinction with precision. Before the establishment of reason's sovereignty, you might worry about whether you have accomplished enough, whether others approve of you, whether you have secured sufficient comfort and recognition. These worries have a desperate quality to them, for your worth seems to hang in the balance, contingent upon outcomes you cannot fully control. The more you worry, the more you reveal your dependence on external validation, your treatment of yourself as an instrument for achieving certain empirical states rather than as an end in yourself. But imagine instead that you have genuinely recognized your own dignity as a rational being, and you have committed yourself to acting according to maxims you can will as universal laws. Now your concern about accomplishment takes a different form. You no longer ask, "Will I accomplish enough?" with the desperate hope that achievement will finally make you worthy of respect. Instead, you ask, "What principles should guide my efforts? What projects align with my duty to myself and others? How can I contribute meaningfully according to rational principle?" The worry about worth dissolves because you have recognized that your worth is not conditional. It is your fundamental nature as a rational being. The worry about accomplishment remains, but it is transformed from anxiety into purposeful concern, from desperate striving into deliberate action. So too with the concern about others' approval. The person governed by inclination often becomes enslaved to the opinions of others, always concerned with how they are perceived, always adjusting their behavior to win approval or avoid disapproval. This creates a terrible vulnerability, for you have made your peace contingent upon forces entirely outside your control. But the person who has recognized their own rational dignity understands that their fundamental worth does not depend on others' opinions. They can care what others think, for respect for others' perspectives is part of honoring their rational dignity, without being enslaved to approval-seeking. They can listen to criticism and learn from it, not because their worth hangs in the balance, but because other rational beings may perceive what they themselves miss. They can act in ways that others disapprove of, not out of defiant arrogance, but out of the conviction that duty requires it, and that all rational beings, if they understood fully, would eventually recognize the justification for the action. This is the transformation that occurs when the sovereign will comes to rest in its own autonomy. The concerns remain. You continue to care about achievement, about the impressions you make on others, about the outcomes of your actions. But these concerns no longer carry the desperate, anxious quality of a will seeking its identity in external validation. They are instead the measured concerns of a being who has found its identity in something that cannot be taken away. The exercise of rational autonomy according to universal principle. Let me offer you a concrete image to embody this understanding. Picture yourself standing in your inner kingdom at sunset. For much of the day, the kingdom was in chaos. Various powers contending for dominance, different inclinations pulling in every direction, no clear governance, no peace. But now, as the day wanes and quietude descends, you observe that order has been established. Reason, which you now recognize as your own deepest nature, sits in judgment at the center. The various faculties and inclinations have assumed their proper positions. Appetite still makes its claims, but it is no longer sovereign. Fear still whispers its warnings, but it is no longer determines the course. Ambition still stirs, but it is now directed by principle, rather than allowed to run wild. You feel the weight of your embodied existence, the reality of your situation in a world you did not create and do not fully control. But you also feel something else. The quiet power of having chosen to govern yourself according to principle, of having claimed your sovereignty, of having recognized and honored your own dignity as a rational being. This feeling is not triumphant or boastful, for there is nothing to boast about in simply recognizing what is true about your nature. Rather, it is the calm satisfaction of having accepted responsibility for yourself, of having taken seriously the fact that you are a being capable of rational autonomy and therefore capable of genuine moral agency. Now, as night falls more fully upon your inner kingdom, you settle into a deeper rest. The concerns of the day have not vanished entirely, but they have been integrated into a framework of principle. You know what you stand for, what principles you will not violate regardless of consequences, what dignity you will not betray for the promise of external reward. This knowledge is profoundly liberating, not despite its firmness, but because of it. You are not adrift in a sea of competing desires. You have an anchor that holds you steady regardless of the tides. What condition is necessary for this peace to deepen and become stable? To become not merely a fleeting state, but a characteristic quality of one's existence? The answer is practice. The consistent, patient exercise of practical reason in examining maxims, recognizing duty, and choosing to act according to principle even when inclination pulls in other directions. The peace we speak of is not a state you achieve once and then maintain effortlessly. It is a condition you cultivate through habitual practice, strengthening through repeated exercise until acting from duty becomes increasingly natural. Think of it this way. When you first learn to ride a bicycle, every movement requires intense concentration. You must think about balance, about pedaling, about steering, about when to brake. The cognitive load is enormous, and the activity is exhausting. But with practice, these skills become integrated. Eventually, you can ride without conscious thought, your body and mind working together in coordinated fluency. The skill becomes part of who you are. So too with moral agency. At first, acting from duty may require constant conscious effort. You must deliberately examine your maxim, test it against the principle of universalizability, recognize what duty requires, and then consciously choose to act from duty despite the pull of inclination. This process is demanding, requiring sustained attention and effort. But with consistent practice, this pattern of moral reasoning becomes integrated into your character. Eventually, recognizing and acting from duty becomes increasingly natural. Not because reason becomes any less demanding, the standard does not change, but because you have developed the capacity to exercise reason fluently, to make the moral law your automatic determining ground. This development of moral character is essential to understanding the final peace we seek, for it is only through such development that the serenity of the sovereign will can become stable and enduring. Initially, one's commitment to acting from principle may be fragile, vulnerable to strong temptations or novel circumstances. But as you practice consistently, as you repeatedly choose principle over inclination, as you notice the growing stability and peace that come from such choices, your commitment deepens. You develop what Kant calls a good will, a settled disposition to make the moral law your supreme determining ground. And here we encounter a remarkable paradox. As you develop this settled disposition to act from duty, duty itself becomes increasingly connected with your inclinations. Not that duty changes, or that you begin to act from inclination rather than from principle. No, the ground of your action remains the recognition of universal law as legislated by your own reason. But as you practice virtue, as you repeatedly act according to principle, you begin to feel happiness in such action. You take pleasure in acting with integrity, in treating yourself and others with respect, in contributing to the actualization of the kingdom of ends. This happiness is not the vulgar happiness of base gratification, the satisfaction of mere appetite, or the relief of escaping difficulty. Rather, it is what the ancients termed eudaimonia, a kind of flourishing that comes from actualizing your distinctive nature and excellence as a rational being. The medieval thinkers called it beatitudo, a blessed state that comes from union with the good. When you act from duty, when you honor rational dignity, when you choose principle over mere inclination, you are expressing your deepest nature and actualizing your highest potential. And in this actualization, a natural happiness arises, not as the goal of your action, but as a companion to it. This is crucial to understand. I do not recommend acting from duty in order to achieve happiness. That would be to make happiness the determining ground of your will, which would reduce duty to mere means for achieving an end. Rather, happiness naturally accompanies the consistent exercise of moral virtue. It is the natural response of a rational being who recognizes itself fully, who actualizes its distinctive capacity for rational autonomy, who exercises this capacity according to the principles that define rationality itself. Imagine reason as an architect who does not create beauty in order to attract residents, but whose attention to proper proportion, harmony, and structure naturally produces buildings that are beautiful. So too, acting from duty does not aim at happiness, but the proper exercise of practical reason. The harmonious ordering of faculties according to universal law naturally produces a condition of flourishing and peace. This understanding transforms the final peace we seek. It is not the peace of having all anxieties removed, all problems solved, all desires satisfied. It is the peace of having recognized and accepted your nature as a rational being, of having committed yourself to exercising this nature according to its defining principles, of having discovered that in doing so, a natural eudaimonia arises. It is the peace that comes not from getting what you want, but from wanting what is truly worth wanting, what is truly aligned with your dignity and your rational nature. Now let us examine what this peace means practically, in the lived experience of one who has genuinely established reason's sovereignty in their inner kingdom. Such a person will face the same challenges and difficulties as anyone else. They will encounter obstacles, face setbacks, deal with loss and disappointment. The external circumstances of their life will be no more perfect than anyone else's, but their response to these circumstances will be fundamentally different. When failure occurs, the person of mature moral character does not descend into despair or self-recrimination, or at least these reactions are significantly moderated and contextualized. Why? Because they understand that their worth is not conditional upon success. They did not act in order to guarantee a particular outcome. They acted according to principle, according to what duty required. If circumstances prevented their action from achieving its intended effect, this diminishes neither their dignity nor their moral worth. They can examine whether they acted wisely, whether they might have foreseen difficulties, whether there are lessons to learn. But all of this is done within a framework of self-respect, not in a desperate attempt to salvage a worth that was never truly dependent on outcomes. When others disapprove or criticize, the person of mature moral character does not immediately assume they have done wrong, nor do they become defensive and dismissive. Instead, they apply the same standard they apply to their own maxims. Is the criticism grounded in principle? Can they learn something from it that would help them act more in accordance with duty? If so, they genuinely listen and adjust. If the criticism is itself grounded in inclination or particular interest rather than universal principle, they can acknowledge it without being moved by it. They treat the critic with respect, genuinely considering their perspective. But they do not make the other's approval the ground of their self-worth or the determining factor in their choices. When they experience loss, when circumstances change in ways they would have preferred to avoid, they are not immune to sadness or disappointment. But these emotions do not throw them into chaos or despair. Why? Because they have grounded their peace not in the stable continuation of favorable circumstances, but in the stable exercise of their rational autonomy. What external circumstances might change, but their capacity to respond to those changes with integrity, with principle, with respect for dignity, remains. They have discovered a foundation that cannot be undermined by the contingencies of the empirical world. This brings us to a profound insight about the nature of freedom and its relationship to peace. True freedom, we have learned, is not the arbitrary ability to do whatever one pleases. Rather, it is the autonomy of a will that gives law to itself, that governs itself according to principles it recognizes as universally valid and rationally necessary. And this freedom is perfectly compatible with law. Indeed, genuine freedom requires law, for without law there would be only arbitrary chance, not true autonomy. But now we discover something even deeper. This freedom is also the foundation of peace. For when you exercise your rational autonomy, when you govern yourself according to universal principle, you are doing something that cannot be taken from you. No external force can prevent you from asking whether a maxim can be universalized. No circumstance can prevent you from choosing to act from duty. No outcome can prevent you from maintaining your dignity by refusing to treat yourself or others as mere means. This freedom, grounded in your rational nature, is absolutely secure and therefore provides a foundation for peace that is also absolutely secure. Consider the person who has placed their peace in external circumstances, in wealth, in health, in others' approval, in the achievement of certain goals. Such a person is always vulnerable, always at risk. The stock market might crash, health might fail, others might withdraw approval, goals might prove unattainable. And when these external props crumble, so too does their peace. They have built on sand, and the inevitable storms of life wash away their security. But consider the person who has placed their peace in the exercise of rational autonomy, in the consistent choice to act according to principle. What could undermine this peace? As long as they retain their rational faculties, they can continue to govern themselves according to universal law. No illness or injury can prevent them from thinking, from evaluating maxims, from recognizing duty. No external circumstance can force them to act from mere inclination. Even in conditions of extreme hardship or deprivation, they retain the capacity to choose how they will respond. What principles will determine their choices? They have built on rock, and no storm can shake their foundation. This is not to suggest that external circumstances are irrelevant to human well-being. Clearly, poverty and illness, violence and oppression cause genuine suffering and constrain the scope of possible actions. A person in chains cannot move freely through the world, though they can still maintain their inner freedom, their moral autonomy. But it is to say that the deepest peace, the most secure foundation for a flourishing life, does not depend ultimately on external circumstances, but on one's commitment to exercising rational autonomy according to universal principle. And here, we must address a question that arises naturally at this point in our investigation. What of the future? You rest here in the quiet darkness, having achieved some measure of understanding and peace. But tomorrow will come. Tomorrow will bring new circumstances, new challenges, new temptations to forget what you have understood tonight. How do you maintain this peace? How do you prevent the anarchy of inclination from reasserting its chaos? The answer lies in what I have called practice, but it is practice understood in the deepest sense. It is not merely repeating an external action mechanically, but habitually exercising your rational faculties in the examination of maxims and the recognition of duty. It is the patient, consistent cultivation of what Aristotle termed practical wisdom, the capacity to recognize, in particular circumstances, what universal principle requires. Each morning will present its challenges. You will feel the pull of inclinations toward ease, comfort, the avoidance of difficulty. You will encounter people whose behavior tempts you toward anger or resentment. You will face choices where duty seems to conflict with immediate self-interest or with the approval of others. In these moments, what will sustain you is the habit of asking, what principle governs here? What maxim would I be following? Can I will this as a universal law? What does my own rational dignity demand? As you ask these questions consistently, day after day, year after year, they become increasingly natural. The practice does not become effortless, for the claims of duty remain just as demanding, but it becomes integrated into your character. You develop a settled disposition to make the moral law your supreme determining ground. This is the development of moral character, and it is the practical means by which the serenity of the sovereign will become stable and enduring. But there is something else that sustains such practice, something we must not overlook: the recognition of community. You do not stand alone in your commitment to rational autonomy and moral principle. You are part of a vast community of rational beings, past and present, who have recognized their own dignity and committed themselves to acting according to universal law. You are part of a tradition of moral thought and practice that stretches back through history. Philosophers, saints, ordinary people who exemplified moral excellence and passed on their wisdom. And you are part of a current community of those who, even now, are making similar commitments, asking similar questions, drawing on similar sources of strength. Think of this community not as something distant or abstract, but as a real presence in your life. When you feel the temptation to act contrary to principle, you remember the examples of those who stood firm. When you doubt whether your commitment matters, you remember that others share it. When you succeed in choosing duty over inclination, you contribute not just to your own peace, but to the actualization of the kingdom of ends, to the progressive recognition of rational dignity throughout the world. You are not alone in this work. Moreover, you can recognize in your own inner peace the confirmation that you are moving in the right direction. The more consistently you act from principle, the more genuine your peace becomes. The more you try to find peace through satisfying mere inclination, through seeking external validation, through treating yourself and others as mere means, the more you will discover that anxiety and restlessness return. Your own experience becomes a teacher, confirming that genuine peace arises from the exercise of rational autonomy according to universal law. So we arrive now at the final understanding. The serenity of the sovereign will is not a state that comes and then goes, not a temporary respite from life's struggles, not something dependent on favorable circumstances. Rather, it is a condition that is progressively actualized through consistent practice, that deepens as you develop moral character, that becomes increasingly stable and reliable as you habitually make the moral law your supreme determining ground. It is the peace of one who has recognized their own rational dignity and committed themselves to honoring it, not once, but continuously. It is the peace of one who has understood that true freedom lies not in arbitrary choice, but in the autonomous exercise of reason according to universal principle. Having established reason's sovereignty in your inner kingdom, you discover something unexpected. The constraints of law are liberating. The requirement to act only according to maxims you can will as universal laws is not an oppressive restriction, but a clarifying principle that enables genuine action. The obligation to treat yourself and others as ends in themselves is not a burden imposed from without, but an expression of your deepest nature and worth. And as the night deepens around you, as your body settles more fully into rest, you can feel this peace settling into the depths of your being. Not as a denial of the world's difficulties or as an escape into fantasy, but as a fundamental reorientation toward reality as it truly is. You are a rational being, capable of autonomous self-governance, worthy of dignity, a participant in the kingdom of ends. These are not aspirations for the future, but truths about your present nature. The work is to recognize them fully and to actualize them consistently through your choices and commitments. The anarchy of inclination that disturbed your peace at the beginning of our investigation is not destroyed by force or suppression, but is transformed through the establishment of rational order. The competing inclinations remain, but they no longer have sovereign power. Reason has taken its rightful place as legislator. The kingdom of your inner life is no longer in chaos, but is increasingly governed by universal law, law that you yourself have legislated through the exercise of practical reason. This is the sovereign will at rest, not passive or inert, but peacefully exercising its autonomy, confidently making choices according to principle, finding in such exercise not burden, but freedom, not constraint, but the deepest form of liberation. It is a will that has discovered that acting from duty, treating oneself and others with the dignity of rational beings, and making the moral law one's supreme determining ground is not the sacrifice of happiness, but its very condition. As you rest here, feeling the weight of your body against the surface that supports you, feeling your breath flowing gently in and out, you can sense the presence of this sovereign will within you. It is not something alien or distant. It is your own deepest nature awakened to itself. The peace it brings is not the peace of having no concerns or challenges, but the peace of having recognized what truly matters. Not external outcomes or others' approval, but your own dignity and autonomy, the consistent exercise of your rational faculty, the progressive actualization of a life governed by universal principle. The journey we have undertaken together through this night has traced a path from the anarchy of inclination, through the legislative function of reason, through the vision of the kingdom of ends, to arrive finally at the serenity of the sovereign will. But this is not merely an intellectual path, a sequence of ideas to be understood abstractly. It is a path you can walk yourself, beginning here and now, continuing through each day and year of your life. The understanding we have explored together provides the map, but you must make the journey yourself through your own consistent choices and commitments. As consciousness releases its grip on your wearied mind, as your thoughts grow quieter and your awareness softer, carry with you the knowledge that you possess within yourself the capacity for genuine peace. Not the peace of mere tranquility, but the peace of one who has recognized their own rational dignity and committed themselves to honoring it. Not the peace that depends on favorable circumstances, but the peace that is grounded in your autonomous exercise of reason according to universal law. Not the peace that is fragile and easily shattered, but the peace that is founded on what no external force can take from you, your rational nature, and your capacity to govern yourself according to principle. We have now journeyed through all 4 arcs of our philosophical investigation, and in their totality, they revealed the architecture of a well-ordered life. We began in the depths of anarchy, where inclinations clash without governance and anxiety reigns. We ascended to understand how reason legislates universal law, establishing order through the categorical imperative and the principle of universalizability. We surveyed the vision of the kingdom of ends, recognizing that genuine community arises through mutual respect for rational dignity. And we arrived finally at the serenity of the sovereign will, the peace of one who has recognized their autonomy and committed themselves to its consistent exercise according to principle. These are not 4 separate states, but 4 dimensions of a single reality, the reality of rational life, of a being that recognizes its own nature and actualizes it through conscious choice and committed practice. They form a coherence, a systematic unity, a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. From the logic of rational autonomy follows necessarily the structure of moral law. From moral law follows the vision of universal community. And from that vision follows the peace of a will that has recognized its own dignity and exercises it consistently. What we have discovered is that the peace you seek, the peace that eludes so many in our anxious world, is not something that must be won from external circumstances or granted by forces beyond your control. It is something within your reach, available to you now, grounded in the very nature of your rationality. It requires no special circumstances, no extraordinary powers, no escape from the world. It requires only that you recognize what is true about yourself, that you are a rational being capable of autonomous self-governance, that you possess inherent dignity that cannot be made conditional upon outcomes, that you have the power to legislate universal laws and make them the determining ground of your choices. The journey toward such recognition and such peace is not completed in a single evening, not even in a single lifetime. It is a work that must be undertaken anew each day, renewed each time the temptation arises to fall back into heteronomy, reinforced through consistent practice and patient cultivation of moral character. But each step along this path is itself a victory. Each time you examine a maxim and test it against the principle of universalizability, you exercise your rational autonomy. Each time you choose duty over mere inclination, you honor your dignity. Each time you treat yourself or another person with respect, you contribute to the actualization of the kingdom of ends. The world in which we live remains imperfect. Violence, deception, and exploitation continue. Not everyone recognizes or respects rational dignity, but this does not render our commitment to principle futile or illusory. It means, rather, that our commitment is all the more necessary, all the more valuable. Each individual who chooses to govern themselves according to universal law, who treats themselves and others with respect for their rational dignity, who refuses to exploit or be exploited, who maintains integrity in the face of pressure to compromise, each such individual contributes to a gradual transformation of the world toward greater recognition of human dignity. Moreover, and this is crucial to understand, such commitment does not depend for its validity on the success of this larger social transformation. You can act according to principle, can maintain your integrity, can honor the dignity of yourself and others, even in a world where such commitment is not yet universal. Your peace, your dignity, your worth do not depend on whether others accept your example or follow your path. They depend only on your own consistent exercise of rational autonomy. This, finally, is the liberation that moral philosophy offers, not the false liberation of freedom from all constraint, but the true liberation of freedom through self-governance according to rational principle. It is the offer to recognize yourself as the sovereign legislator of your own inner kingdom, to acknowledge your own dignity and the dignity of all rational beings, to experience the peace that comes not from having all desires satisfied, but from having ordered your desires according to principle. If this rational inquiry has brought you clarity and peace, if the examination of these philosophical truths has provided you with a firmer foundation for understanding your own nature and dignity, we invite you to continue this work. Seek out other philosophical explorations that deepen your understanding of practical reason and moral law. Practice daily the examination of your maxims and the recognition of duty. Cultivate relationships and communities built on mutual respect for rational dignity. Contribute, through your choices and commitments, to the progressive actualization of the kingdom of ends. The Enlightenment, of which this philosophy is part, was founded on a single conviction: that human beings are capable of using their reason to understand themselves and their world, to govern themselves according to principle, to make progress toward justice and dignity. That conviction remains valid. That call remains urgent. The path is laid open before you. The capacity to walk it resides within you. All that remains is the decision to begin, and the commitment to continue. Dare to know. Sapere aude. Recognize yourself as a rational being worthy of dignity. Acknowledge your capacity for autonomous self-governance. Exercise this capacity consistently according to universal law. Build your kingdom of reason, stone upon stone, principle upon principle, until the inner chaos becomes ordered, until anxiety gives way to peace, until the anarchy of inclination is transformed by the legislation of reason into a harmonious whole. This is the path toward the serenity of the sovereign will. This is the work of a lifetime. This is the highest calling of human reason and human dignity. Begin now, continue always, and discover in the consistent exercise of your rational autonomy the peace you have sought, the worth you have questioned, the freedom you have yearned for. The night is deep now, and the journey is complete. Rest in the knowledge that within you lies the power to establish peace in your inner kingdom. Rest in the dignity of your rational nature. Rest in the freedom of your autonomous will. Rest in the serenity of one who has recognized themselves truly and committed themselves fully to the highest good. Sleep well, knowing that tomorrow will bring new opportunities to exercise your rational autonomy, new occasions to honor the dignity of yourself and others, new moments in the ongoing work of actualizing the kingdom of ends. And in each such moment, carry with you the truth you have discovered tonight. You are free, you are worthy, you are capable of genuine moral agency, and in the consistent exercise of this agency lies the peace that passes all understanding. Sapere aude. Dare to know, dare to be.